Self-doubt is something most of us deal with. For this video, I interviewed some interesting people from different industries to get their take on self-doubt, because I think confident is a lie. At least the idea that most of us have about it is. We usually talk about it as if it's a place you arrive at and then your work is done, but it's more that you practice confidence, and it changes depending on the situation you're in. So I have two fashion models, two psychologists, two esports and video game educators, a filmmaker, and a psychology master's student. So we're gonna go into what self-doubt is, things that can affect it more than you might think, like parenting, education, things like impostor syndrome, and of course ways to actually manage self-doubt. Because I think confidence is just a consequence. It is only the byproduct of other things.
Where I come from, modeling is not a career. That's not a thing.
Tell a kid enough that their own ideas aren't the right answer, then all of a sudden when someone tells you to go for it, to try, to have some ideas, have some input, that's the most frightening thing that those kids can think of.
Some people think because I'm so jovial and excited that, or maybe I never doubt myself, I'm like the worst in my own head, but privately.
You know, when do I tell myself I'm a professional? When do you say you've made it?
There's no crystal ball. You just have to try and take things on and learn where your individual limit is.
You know, it's sort of like learning to play a new musical instrument or something. There's no reason why you should be good at it if you haven't done it much.
Life is full of unpleasant experiences, and when we resist or avoid them, it feels good in the moment, but it decreases our ability to tolerate adversity over time. So this is a quote from Ruben Chavez, and I think it's relevant to the idea of dealing with self-doubt. But is doubt even bad in the first place? So with the help of doctors Diana Breacher and Martin Anthony, we'll look a little bit into that, and I think defining self-doubt would be a good place to start.
One way to describe it is simply second-guessing yourself. It's a hesitancy, it's a reluctance to perhaps take a risk, questioning your competence perhaps, or your confidence, or if it's the right thing to do. It's not a diagnosis of anything. I think it's a description of what probably happens to many of us, wherever we feel a little bit vulnerable or compared to the people around us, perhaps not as skilled or comfortable in that role.
So it can range from not having enough doubt. So people who maybe have a lot of narcissistic traits where they think that they're much better than they are at a whole bunch of things, to having doubt that's crippling, that prevents people from doing the things that they need to do.
So what I learned is that self-doubt is not a diagnosable thing. It's not like depression, for example. It's more of a description of what we experience. Feelings of self-doubt are an emotional response, and usually for good reason. When it's our response to everything, it's a problem. But when it's in manageable doses, it can actually be pretty helpful. So let's call that polished doubt. Obviously, that begs the question of where that limit is of having enough doubt, and how much control do we actually have? So I asked, how much control do you think we have when it comes to negative thought and internal emotions?
Here's one research study that's fascinating, and we can even do it right now. I want you to not think about a pink bunny sitting on my head. You can't not think about it.
Yeah.
Right? As soon as you try to suppress a thought, it gets more intense. When we let them go, they tend to reduce in intensity.
Do you think there are any benefits to doubting yourself? Where do you think that threshold lies between having maybe a little too much and not having enough?
You know, there is no kind of official line where self-doubt becomes a problem. It probably depends on lots of different things. So the context. So some people, for example, may have a lot of self-doubt around certain domains in their life. For example, I'm not much of an athlete, and if I was sort of forced to be on a football team or something, I would have a lot of self-doubt in that situation. I think what we would look, whether self-doubt is a problem or not really depends on the extent to which it's causing problems for a person. So is it interfering with their life? Is it stopping them from doing things that are important to them? Does it bother them? Is it distressing to them? A little bit of self-doubt is actually a good thing. If you have no self-doubt, then you're not going to prepare adequately for things or sort of take the care that you need to take to kind of get things done and to do a good job at things. So we want to question some of our actions and question some of our abilities in order to perform at a sort of a peak kind of level.
Like many things, there's a continuum, and the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. You know, the absence of self-doubt might be confidence. Too much confidence is a problem. Not enough confidence is the problem. So for all of us, we want confidence that's grounded in reality.
I know this might not be a straightforward answer to the level of doubt you should have, but I think the idea of confidence grounded in reality is a good direction to go towards. Some of the things we'll talk about in the how to manage self-doubt part of the video, we'll kind of go into more details. But before we get into that, I think there are 3 things that are really important to consider, and that's the roles of imposter syndrome, parenting, and education. Impostor syndrome, or the impostor phenomenon, is when you doubt your own skills and achievements. So you think that the reason you've achieved these things is because of luck, or because someone made a mistake in letting you be in your position at work, for example. So you kind of start to feel like a fraud for being where you are. You doubt whether or not you actually know what you're doing. This phenomenon is really important to talk about because I think it plays a big role in self-doubt, especially at work. I don't usually hear anyone talk about it in career conversations, but it probably affects a lot of us, more so now than ever before, because there are so many jobs that didn't even exist a few years ago. So how can you feel confident in your expertise if the career path doesn't even have enough history for you to compare yourself to? Here are some stories from the people I interviewed about doubt in their careers. How did it feel to be going towards a career that didn't exist?
Well, it was weird because I always knew that it needed to happen because video games, they encapsulate so much with regard to learning that how could you not see the opportunity there?
I've had imposter syndrome a lot because I've done a lot already with the time I have here, and some of the opportunities I've had have been crazy, and they're way out of line with my age. And I am learning that I know very little, and learning all these things that I still have to get used to. And yeah, it's something I've battled with a lot.
Where I come from, modeling is not a career. That's not a thing. Past like maybe 4 or 5 years, I was in the construction world. So another thing that, it was a self-doubt for me was I wasn't tall. You didn't necessarily see a lot of people my color skin. So I was born with teeth missing. So I had to go through a whole process to get my teeth done. So that was another self-doubt thing. So, so all these things leveled up to me being like, this could never be something that I can generate income from.
At first it was really tough, upon being signed, there was still a lot that I had to do to prepare myself. At the time I had a lot of acne. I was still really, really skinny, so my measurements weren't where they should be. So it took me about a year, maybe 9 months after I got signed before I actually started getting shoots and getting into the actual modeling.
Yeah, I didn't go to film school. I didn't study any of these. I studied all this from the internet in my own free time. I did however many years of schooling. I went 3 years of undergrad, did 1 year of postgrad, and dropped it all. And now I make a living with a camera and my laptop. So who's when do I tell myself I'm a professional? And like I was saying, when do you say you've made it?
Impostor syndrome is basically, it's actually a recognition of your expertise when you think you're an imposter, because everyone else will see you as very knowledgeable, but you know how much more there is yet to learn or know or acquire. I had a very good friend who I was in grad school with, received a professor offer from a very prestigious university in the US. She called me and said, "Do you think they made a mistake?" She's so bright and so talented and cutting edge and the whole thing. And her first question was, "Do you think they made a mistake?" And it's because she's so well versed in her field that she knows that there are people who know more than her.
We know accurately only when we know little. Doubt grows with knowledge. Some of the people I interviewed were still up and coming, but others are pretty established in their fields. Yet, imposter syndrome and doubt in general still shows up. But it's important to understand that even though it's called self-doubt, it's not always generated internally by the person. One of the studies I read on contextualizing the impostor phenomenon explains that only looking at it on an individualistic level limits our ability to address the issue. The study argues that social context and social hierarchies also play an important role in a person's level of feeling like an imposter, and it tends to be more present in women and minority groups. So the example that's given is if a certain minority group is stereotyped as being unintelligent, then someone from that group, a minority student for example, might think their acceptance to a good university was because of luck, rather than something they actually deserve. And while we're on the topic of schooling, education is so important in developing our sense of self, because we're usually there during the most formative years of our lives. But schools don't usually help us foster independence, or teach us how to navigate problems in our own way, or how to even face ourselves. Instead, the mentality in most educational systems is pretty paralyzing. As Kim Koyasaki would say, it's do as you're told, don't make mistakes, and there's only one right answer. This kind of feedback from schools creates doubt because it forces us to limit ourselves out of fear of failure. So to quote Sir Ken Robinson, what we do know is that if you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original. And by the time they get to be adults, most kids have lost that capacity.
And all this came to a head in the 11th grade when my dad showed me a TED Talk from an amazing individual that everyone watching this should go and watch, called Sir Ken Robinson. And it is titled, How Do Schools Kill Creativity? And it talks about exactly what you're discussing. This idea that in this environment of you're 16, you're 17, you have to have perfect grades, and the rest of your life hinges on decisions you make for the next 4 years, period. What kid wants to make a mistake in that environment? And schools do everything they can to discourage those mistakes. And that, combined with the increasing competition that we see in universities for kids to get in and for jobs afterward, is unbelievably destructive to kids, because they have to compete even more at that time in school when they might be at their worst period of struggling ever during puberty. And so it's not just parents, it's the institution that we park kids in for their entire youth that drives kids away from institutions. And so I saw this TED Talk, and then I got assigned, as an example, in 11th grade, this kind of school, we were assigned a science fair poster board assignment with assigned topics. So literally, for an 11th grade student, go and research a basic premise of, like, I believe it was philosophy or sociology. Go and look it up and make a 3-panel poster board about it. I did not do my assigned topic. I did a topic on Sir Ken Robinson and how schools kill creativity. And I received a C grade. And I received a C, and the only cited reason was didn't follow instructions. The teacher turned around in class, saw me standing there holding my piece of paper. I don't have a piece of paper on me. She just goes, what? And I looked at her in the middle of class, standing on my desk, and I just went, can you even spell irony? Right back to the principal's office.
The way in which we give feedback to children can affect whether or not they kind of develop what they call a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. So Carol Dweck is the researcher who's written a book on mindset. And a fixed mindset is basically a reluctance to take risks. So let's say math is hard, and maybe you failed an exam. You kind of go, I'm not good at math, as opposed to someone with a growth mindset saying, I really blew it on that exam. I'm going to find a way to really learn this material differently. With this attitude towards life being not yet. So I don't know this yet. I haven't figured this out yet. Carol Dweck in her TED Talk talks about a high school in Chicago that if you got a failing grade for a course, for example, what you received on your report card was not yet. So nested in that is the assumption that we are works in progress, that with effort we will achieve.
This idea of not yet. The development of growth mindsets in people needs to be more of a focus, and not just in education systems, but in parenting too. maybe more importantly. When you develop that type of mindset, your thinking changes from doubt due to lack of skill into confidence in your lack of skill. As in, you accept that you're not quite there yet and become open to your deficiencies. So this is something that parents should really focus on. I don't think they always realize how much influence they actually have on their kids, and not necessarily in the most obvious ways.
I think it's a really serious systemic problem and I think a lot of lack of confidence comes from kids, because fundamentally, how can you have confidence that you made the right decision when you basically made that decision under duress? The schooling institution and your parents and everybody else associated with that, anybody else with a stake in your education or a concern for your future, has basically held your life in duress and forced you to make a decision about what you're going to do. I can see how a lot of kids would have a lack of confidence in the decisions they've made, especially kids who then go on to university to struggle. And I think that's why we see the increasing rate of competition combined with that amount of self-destructive pressure and decision under duress. And then we see the increasing rise of self-harm and mental health distress in university students. And we throw our hands up in the air as a society and say, how is this happening? We have no reason why this could be happening. It was never like this when I was a kid. No, it wasn't like this when you were a kid, and that's the problem.
The way my family was, if you weren't of the same mindset or basically perfectly in line with my parents, it wasn't an option really. The thing is, growing up with that, it wasn't just you have a different opinion than me, it's that your opinion is wrong. And that interrupted the natural progression or formation of my characteristics.
And it's a trust thing too. What happens when your source of affirmation, which is usually your parents, tells you that you're doing things wrong all the time? Then
it's not great.
No. Creates a lack of trust, like you said, in yourself.
Absolutely. At the very least, it can be way more extreme than that. Things like borderline personality disorder are linked to basically being told all of your emotions and ideas are wrong. Then all of a sudden, when someone tells you to go for it, to try, to have some ideas, have some input, that's the most frightening thing that those kids can think of.
There's this story from Neil deGrasse Tyson that's stuck in my head. I was listening to a podcast that he was on, and he's talking about a time where he was at a park and he sees this woman. It's a rainy day and the woman's kid is really trying to jump in puddles as they're walking by, and the woman keeps pulling the kid away. So Neil explains how that's a perfect example of seeing what happens when you apply force to a liquid, but that we tend to kind of squash curiosity in kids with little actions like that. I'm telling you this story because when we're young, our caretakers tend to be our source of affirmation. We're not necessarily able to figure things out yet, so we look to them for guidance on the integrity of our actions. But if we're pulled away every time, like a kid trying to jump in the puddles, doesn't that create a lack of trust between ourselves and our own thoughts? So those subtle interactions between a kid and their parent make a big difference.
Actually spoke about the time that our 4-year-old at the time, there was a puddle on the ground and she crouched down into the puddle, all on her belly, and started swimming. And she looked up at us with such confidence to say, because she wasn't using words like that, she was like, look, I'm swimming.
Yeah.
And we both looked at her and said, yo, you're swimming. And she just looked up, and we were talking about how the two of us turned around and we were just so, and it's weird I'm about to say this, we were so proud of her for believing that. Do you understand what I'm saying? She's like, you know what? I'm gonna swim in this puddle.
The confidence in her own thoughts, in her
This
own...
is what I'm saying. We were just talking about that the other day. And so if we look at things in terms of experimentation, but all connecting to self-doubt in some way, that's where we get our confidence from.
Alright, we've gone through a lot of the surrounding elements of self-doubt. And if there's anything I've learned from this project, it's that doubt changes, and it's not something that completely goes away. But there are definitely ways to keep it at rest or learn how to use it. As we go through them, you'll notice that most of them are pretty internal, more practice-based ways of dealing with doubt, and there's a reason for that. If your response to things is mostly negative, in this case as having too much doubt, that's because you've been trained to respond that way, and it's likely automatic. So to be able to counter that, you have to learn to make those automatic responses positive. It needs to become habitual and unconscious.
You know, when we talk about control or willpower is great, but it's a finite resource. And the more we use it, the less we have of it. So we can exercise self-discipline and control in certain contexts. But if we want it to be an automatic behavior, we have to actually rely on routine, doing things repetitively for a long, long time. And then it just becomes like second nature and we don't think about it at all.
First, the more straightforward ways of dealing with self-doubt. Confident is not a blanket statement. We can all apply a certain level of confidence in certain contexts, but how much we have in each of those situations changes based on so many things. So how much you know about a subject, if it's a comfortable environment, if you haven't slept well. For me, my confidence changes based on 3 things, and they kind of all come down to comfort. The first is mindfulness. How do I feel about myself? Am I rested? Am I feeling comfortable in my body? And the second is familiarity of environment. Do I know how to interact with my surroundings and where things are? And the third one is task-related knowledge. So am I competent enough to do the task at hand? If I'm feeling high levels of confidence in one lane, the others can be more off balance. So think of it like lanes of stimuli or familiarity. The more there are unfamiliar things, the less confident I usually am because I have to be more cautious with every step. A good way to fight that in an unstable life is to have anchor points. So something you do daily or frequently enough that it acts as a stable point in your life. For some people I've talked to, this was making a cup of coffee before work. It's pretty simple, but it acts as an unofficial starting point or a marker for starting your day. For me, my anchor point is sleep. So when I wake up at a similar time every day, I feel like I have my shit together. And even if I don't get everything done that day, I still feel like I didn't waste time and that the day had structure. These things act as stable points in your life to point you in the direction of where to go next. This one's a more personal approach, but I find that I feel a lot of self-doubt when I'm feeling overwhelmed or when I'm trying to process too many things at once. This can look like trying to figure out the structure of a video while also trying to do the research for it. So when I catch myself doing things like this, what usually clears my head is refocusing on one task and just doing that. It doesn't necessarily have to be until I finish it, but I find that other related tasks line up properly as I work on one thing, and it lets me move forward, even if it's not in the most elegant way. Those 2 methods, anchor points and minimizing and executing, were things that are kind of easier to start doing. So now for the methods that need a bit more effort, and I'll let Dr. Breacher explain why that's important because it's related to something called hedonic adaptation.
You know, for some people, retail therapy is what they do. You know, I've had a bad day, I'm going to go buy something that will make me feel better. The problem with those type of acquisitions is that it's called hedonic adaptation. Well, hedonic adaptation is the capacity that all humans have to adapt. So we adapt to hardship, but we also adapt to the good times. So that shiny new relationship, job, house, when you first acquired that, it's marvelous. And then as time goes on, you either take it for granted or you start to see the flaws. So if you want to feel better about yourself, the time span of joy from a new outfit is going to be much more limited than doing something you're really proud of, having those experiences that actually fulfill us in a very different kind of way.
So as Dr. Breacher explained, it's in doing things that you're proud of that you get long-lasting effects. Self-confidence is earned. You can't lie to yourself. To believe that you have self-worth, you have to do things that you value. And that can be big or small, but either way, growth and improvement take time. With that in mind, the first thing that can curb a lot of self-doubt is learning as much as you can. We talked about having a growth mindset earlier, and that's something you have to have. This notion of, I just haven't learned it yet. Especially if you're starting something new. Something that's put me at peace is understanding that you're usually at your worst when you're starting, and everyone that's ever gained any success gained it by acquiring knowledge along the way. And just by accepting that, you've kind of created an even playing field. So think of it like a game. You're just doing the tutorial now, and you'll get a chance to level up as you progress. And with that mindset, you'll notice that you start to become self-sufficient. It gives you a calm feeling knowing you can figure it out eventually, and you start to gain confidence through competence. So do you think a big part of mitigating negative thoughts is exposure therapy?
Yeah, so exposure therapy basically involves doing things that you're afraid to do. If somebody's very shy, for example, they may be nervous about talking to other people, and by practicing doing that, two things happen. One is people learn that whatever it is they're predicting might happen doesn't happen, so it gets easier over time. But also their skills get better. A lot of times when we completely avoid situations, we're also just not very good at it because we haven't had a lot of practice. You know, it's sort of like learning to play a new musical instrument or something. There's no reason why you should be good at it if you haven't done it much.
Yeah.
I mean, you spoke about public speaking earlier yourself. In my final year of university, my postgrad, that's when, all of a sudden, every 10 days or so, you're probably standing up in front of a whole lot of people and doing some public speaking. You're there with your friends, your peers, and you're going to get judged immediately. Not like a test where you can fail, but it's behind closed doors and your teacher's going to mark it. It was all of a sudden it's up front, and it's very exposing. But when I look back at it, that was probably the best thing that ever happened to me, was being forced to having to do that. I started the first couple terrible, but eventually, just after practice, doing it so many times, by the end of the year, I actually won the award for best presenter. Don't try be like the best in the class. I was always at first trying to be like, I want to be like that dude, he's so good at presenting. Then I realized, okay, what are my strengths? I think just little things that I found myself comfortable doing made me feel like, I got into the groove of it. And after doing it maybe 100 times by the end of the year, I actually looked forward to it.
What goes hand in hand with learning is practicing humility. Again, to reiterate, we know accurately only when we know little. Doubt grows with knowledge.
My dad has a saying, an empty vessel makes the most noise. And he would say to me, anytime you hear people making a lot of noise, you can almost guarantee that often it's because they just need to make noise in order to attract or do something. I don't know why we got into this space where everybody has to pretend to know everything. I'm telling you right now, I don't know everything. And I don't want to pretend to know everything. And that, to me, that's very taxing. I would never openly call myself an esports expert. Somebody might write a description that says that ends up on my website, but I would never say to you, I'm a video games expert. I just don't, there's too much data out there for me to claim to be an expert of anything.
I think humility is a really underrated way of getting over doubt. The more you practice being the student, the more you'll be comfortable asking questions when you're unsure, or admitting you failed at something and seeking guidance. In a way, it lets you move on, and that helps when you're feeling like an imposter too. You start to accept that anyone who's learned anything has likely learned it from someone else. There is always a transference of knowledge. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you should seek guidance from anyone, more so that you should be open to input. There's something you should be aware of, something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's how we all have pockets of incompetence or lack of skill that we can be unaware of that make us think we're better than we actually are at a given skill. Or, on the other hand, if we're really good at something, we sometimes think that people around us are also knowledgeable in that area. Those are both mistakes in measuring your own expertise, and this effect isn't visible to those experiencing it. So I thought I'd mention it, since it kind of relates to humility. I've linked a TED-Ed video in the notes that explains it properly. The last thing I wanted to talk about is probably the overarching philosophy behind dealing with self-doubt. 3 very powerful words are I'm not them. It's admitting to yourself that there are so many differences between you and another person that it's a completely unfair comparison. I tend to use those words when I'm feeling a bit of jealousy or envy towards someone. I try to focus on the hand I've been dealt instead, because that's when I can start to be more aware of what I have and where I can improve. I guess it's kind of a form of gratitude. To quote Ruben again, in order to genuinely love and accept yourself, you must first get to know yourself. So that's number 1, awareness of the good and the bad so you can move forward or backwards accordingly. The second part of the process is acceptance, which we kind of touched on with the 3 words I'm not them, but it's also creating a deep belief that how you perform or how you feel about yourself is going to fluctuate. It's not a consistent thing, and it's not supposed to be. For some reason, we treat high levels of confidence and happiness like they should always be there. But if you think about it, they're more extreme states, far from neutral.
It's not healthy. A friend of mine went and was seeing a therapist, and they relayed something that the therapist said that really affected me too, which is that if someone's sad all the time, that's not healthy, because they're experiencing a single emotion on the wheel. Of all the possible emotions, you spin the wheel, you land on a certain one for whatever reason. But if you're only sad, that's very unhealthy. Joy is a result of stimulus. And if you are perpetually joyful in spite of stimulus, that's mania. Every emotion you have is also chemically related. And your brain can only do so much with chemicals. It can only make so much of chemicals. And so you can exhaust and tap your system out.
When you hold yourself to that standard too, of always trying to be positive and confident every single day, when you do have that off day where you're not feeling yourself, something's going wrong, it's going to tear you down a lot more.
The final step is compassion towards yourself. I read a study on buffering imposter feelings with kindness, and it explained how people who have higher levels of doubt in the form of impostor syndrome tended to have low levels of self-compassion. So these people thought they were different from others in that they couldn't make mistakes or fail. To be honest, I feel like that fairly often. We all know that's not possible. So we need to make sure to be gentler with ourselves, because we all fail. It's how you react afterwards that matters. What I've learned from my conversations with all these wonderful people is that self-doubt, and in contrast confidence too, are just byproducts of other things, which is a good thing. It makes self-doubt more approachable. And look, there's a lot I couldn't fit in here, surprisingly. I know it's long, but I'll be posting those on other platforms, and I'll link them in the notes below. My final piece of advice from all this is to treat interactions with yourself like you would interactions with someone else, with respect and compassion, while paying enough attention to listen when needed.